Yeah, well, let's dig in. Hello, everybody. I'm David Cooks, and I tell you what, paralysis can take on many, many forms. It can be physical like mine, or it can be psychological.
You can do anything you put your mind to. What seems impossible can be done by you.
And what we try to do is feature stories that go from difficult places to fulfilling purpose.
It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you. Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose.
You're in for a treat today.
Yeah.
If your team can function well without your presence, you've done a good job building your team. If they can't, then you have created a dependency which handicaps your team. It's your greatest value is to build a team that can function well without you. They don't have to have you there to perform.
Paralysis to purpose.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks, and thank you so much for tuning in, supporting the podcast, sharing it with someone, leaving us a review. That's always very important. I appreciate it. This never gets old to me because every time I get behind the mic, I get to speak with one of the most intriguing and inspiring people on the planet. And today's no exception. In fact, this guy lives in Alaska. I don't know if I've gotten all 50 states yet in the podcast, but I need to put that as a goal. He's in Anchorage, Alaska. Our guest today is the author of a book that I just finished, and it's called Train to Lead. It is the Unstoppable Leader's Plan for Peak Performance, and it is outstanding. It is a holistic, step-by-step, 90-day leadership development journey built on athletic training principles. And that's what made it so unique for me, having coached basketball for 30 years and been involved in athletics, to have some of the analogies continue to work in the area of leadership was amazing. I was speaking this week at a teacher's professional development and was sharing with them that I believe educators are coaches and coaches are educators, and they both are leaders in some capacity or another, whether they've embraced that or not. And I think we can talk about some of that today. Christian Muntean is an advisor to owners, executives, boards. As the founder of Vantage Consulting, Christian has empowered owners and executives of small and medium-sized businesses to boost their top-line revenues by over $1.5 billion. That's pretty impressive. Even more valuable, they've achieved this while reclaiming precious time for their loved ones and passion. We're going to talk about that because he spends a lot of time in this book on self-care, self-reflection, family, how much is enough, some of those types of things that I think are really important and prevent burnout. He's got a couple other books out there that have also been very successful. He is a husband, he's a father. Christian, welcome to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. We are honored to have you here.
Well, thank you, David. I'm honored as well. I'm looking forward to it.
Before we get into some specifics about the book, let the audience know a little bit more about you. I mean, you're in Anchorage, Alaska. I don't know how you got there and how many people on the listen to the podcast know people in
Alaska. Yeah, I was brought here in a sky blue school bus that was repurposed as a home. So when I was a kid, my parents moved up here, and we moved up from Minnesota, and they kind of threw all in, sold everything they had, converted a school bus into a kind of an RV, and drove up here and started over. So became home. This is where I grew up, and this is where I've come back to. I've gone other places over the years, but this has become home for me. I've been married for 15 years, and my kids are 12, 10, and 8. I got 2 boys and a girl.
Fantastic. We celebrated our 17th year.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. The same to you. Marriage is a great thing, and it's a lot of work. And I tell people all the time, celebrate your wins and keep it moving forward. Let's get into your book a little bit. Before that, though, let's talk about this Brazilian jiu-jitsu thing.
Yeah.
I don't know very many people
that
live in Alaska or do this as a passionate thing. Where did that come from?
I was introduced to it from actually the same guy that got me into strength and conditioning training. And so he was the fitness instructor for the fire department up here. And he started getting into Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And he is one of the toughest human beings I've ever met in a lot of different ways. And so I paid attention to the things that he was doing. He's also maybe 10 years older than me. And so he was always a role model in terms of fitness, of someone who was always older than me, but always a lot fitter than me. I was like, how does he do that? So when he got into things, I looked at it, and he was getting into jiu-jitsu. I got interested in it. Long time before that, I used to do some other Korean martial arts. I always had an interest, but hadn't been in it for a while. And so I got into it about almost 7 years ago. I fell in love with it. It's a passion.
One of the stories you tell in the book is about the first competition that you had gone to. Talk about that first time you were there, and it didn't go so well.
No, it very much did not go well. I got beat twice. And when you get beat in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's a little bit like if you're not familiar with Jiu-Jitsu, most people are familiar with MMA, mixed martial arts, or boxing. When you get beat in any sport like that, you're literally getting beat. And it's not fun. It's not like getting beat in a race where you just feel bad afterwards. You genuinely feel bad in a lot of ways. So the first tournament I went to, I had 2 matches, and I just got beat in both of them. And it was such an unpleasant experience that I never wanted to do it again. I still like the sport, but I just wasn't going to compete anymore. And I had a conversation with someone else who was an advanced practitioner in jiu-jitsu. He was also a former, I believe he's Marine Force Recon. And he had said, yeah, I felt the same way. I had the same experience, which just shocked me that somebody like him, who's a tough as nails kind of a guy, would also feel like, I don't want to do this anymore either. But he said what he did is he realized he needed to keep going. And so he advised me, do at least 3 or 4 more tournaments. And don't worry about winning or losing. Just worry about winning the mental game. Being able to face tough opposition, being able to face something that's difficult, that's challenging, that makes you feel afraid, that creates that spike of adrenaline that's hard to think through, all of that stuff that goes on. And just learn to be calm and to think through that and keep your head and just go for that. So I've done that, and it was great experience. And I ended up winning tournaments after that because I pushed through that. My very next tournament, I went to it and I decided, okay, I don't care if I win, which wasn't entirely true, but I decided that, I wasn't going to go in thinking I need to win each match. My goal was to be intentional about every choice I make in the fight. I want to be aware of what I'm doing, and I want to be intentional about each choice. Win or lose, I want to know what I was doing all the way to the end. And I ended up winning all my matches in my division. It was great. Then I had fun. Then it became a great experience. But the lesson from that for me was about the importance of mindset. And when you have your mindset right, when you have your perspectives right, how different the experience is, even though the actual environment may even be precisely the same thing.
One of the things that I found interesting in that story that you just shared with us is you figured out a different way to measure your success. How important is that for leaders, as you begin to try to change companies and do different things and work with your employees? How intentional should that be in terms of defining that for your employees, the people on your team or whatever?
It is really important for a lot of different reasons. 2 that come to mind. One is I often work with companies that are struggling with something, and they have ideas about what success should look like. They need to get to a certain point, and often those measurements of success are ego-driven. There's something about, I need to prove myself to somebody, or I need to hit certain revenue numbers and then I've become somebody, whatever the thing is. And those ways of defining success, you can never actually win at it. Because if you finally build a $10 million company, then you should have built a $100 million company. The goalposts keep moving. It's good to have clear. It's fine to build a 10 or 100 or whatever size company, but and you want to be clear about your metrics that you're trying to pursue. But success has to be a little bit more thoughtful than that, I think. And part of it, what happens is, for example, I was just talking with a client last week who missed his revenue goals that he was supposed to hit. It's a company that's owned by another one, so he's reporting to other people, and they missed their revenue goals, and so he's really bummed by it because success would be hitting those revenue goals. But the deeper reality is that he didn't slip in revenue, and he had a year that a lot of things went sideways. A lot of projects went sideways. Some key employees had some major health issues and were actually pulled straight out of work. And it really could have easily have been a year that damaged the company and sent them backwards. But instead, because of work that he's been doing to build leadership on his team rose to the occasion, were able to fill in the gaps for where other team members couldn't step up. And they were able to hold position for the year. And that doesn't feel successful to him because he didn't hit a revenue target. But to me, that revenue will come in next year. They won the projects. They weren't able to perform the work, but that's going to all come in. But they were able to hold ground when all sorts of problems came up against them. And there was all sorts of reasons to lose ground. And to me, I feel like they had a fantastic year. But if they don't see it, they can't enjoy that. And they can't really experience the benefits of that.
Yeah, it sounds like they controlled the controllables, and then they managed everything else that was going haywire.
They did everything they could have done, and they did it well, but he wasn't feeling successful. And so I wanted to help reframe that. There's another side of success too that I think is important, where companies do achieve success. Like I've got a different client, and I helped them lead a turnaround a few years ago. And within the last 3.5, 4 years, they've doubled their revenues, went from about 20 million to 45 million. So just over doubling it. And that's from a turnaround position. And they've maintained their management team all the way through, which is rare to do that. What's interesting is I think most people, when they pursue that kind of success, they imagine that once you hit the plateau of success, it's all this nice, steady downhill slope where you don't have to work hard anymore and there's no more challenges. And what I tell my clients is that doesn't exist. You should just aspire to new, more interesting problems. There's always going to be something. You just want it to be a different kind of somethings. But part of it too is helping them being able to recognize you've done it. You've achieved this level of success that you wanted. There's going to be new challenges, but you have to also be able to enjoy what you've accomplished. Because if all you feel is like there's more mountains in this mountain range, and that's all you can see is what's ahead of you, and you can't embrace or celebrate anything that you've done, then that becomes very defeating and fatiguing on its own. I think set realistic standards for success and then being able to actually recognize it when you've achieved it.
I think it's also a challenge for people in general, athletically, I know this for sure. Once you get to the top, to stay at the top, is probably even more challenging than what it took you to get there. I remember coaching my first high school coaching job in the Northeast, and we had a team that went winless for 1 year. And
Wow.
yeah, exactly. Wow. And it's where I learned about finding wins in the midst of losses and how we had to change how we were going to measure our success. We began to measure progress and improvement versus outcomes. I don't know how you feel about that in terms of the real world. When I taught economics for some students that were really struggling, I began to grade them on progress versus the outcome of an exam because I could see that. How important is that in helping people to be able to celebrate things, even though it may not be A+? It may be a B+ instead of an A+.
There's a lot of directions to go with that because most of the people that I work with are either entrepreneurs or they're CEOs or something like that. And so they're usually pretty driven people. As a rule, they're driven people. They're A++ type people.
Yep.
And what I often advise them is that if they really want to grow and be successful and they want their teams to be successful, they have to learn to accept B grades. And that's specifically what I say. B quality work, B grades. It's still honor roll. It's still better than average. But if you require everything to be A+ to be perfect, you're just going to wear everyone out. And the reality is very few people can differentiate between B quality work and A quality work. So the effort it'll take for you to get your team to be A quality, each individual, probably isn't going to be worth it. It'll take a lot of extra effort for probably indiscernible gain. And there's a lot of studies around this, but what a really effective leader can do is take a B grade team, and by helping them work together really well, they can produce A quality results.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a leader focuses on that, how do I get them to synergize well, support each other well, for this to be a real healthy group that works hard together? They can produce high quality results over a long time.
In the book, you mentioned the difference between being a perfect Christian and an effective Christian.
I grew up where I was explicitly taught you need to have an A plus. Anything below that is a failure. It was very zero-sum thinking. And so that was stressful growing up. And I was a good student, but I wasn't a consistent A plus student in every grade, every class, every test. But if I didn't get that, I heard about it.
Yes.
And that drilled home that idea of you have to be exactly perfect in everything became a deep lesson for me. And what I found is it creates a fear of failure, which also inhibits trying.
Mm.
And so I was holding back on things because I was afraid it wouldn't be the best, or I would never finish projects because I was afraid it wouldn't be perfect. And so there was all sorts of ways, at least the way it manifested in my life, it held me back, this concept of perfection or A plus. And when through a coach that I was working with named Alan Weiss, he introduced me, and it's kind of a cliche, but the idea of progress, not perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the thing that really started to free me up, was this idea of if I pursue getting better than where I was, that's really what I want. And if I can focus on that, as opposed to just getting it perfect straight out of the gate, then that'll be better overall. So I think that's important.
Before we take a break, I want to ask you about the importance of self-care from a leadership standpoint.
I believe that you lead from who you are. You can't lead really beyond yourself sustainably. And leaders who try to eventually trip over themselves in some way. And you see this. You and I have both been around long enough where you see leaders who the chickens came home to roost, so to speak, and things caught up with them in their careers or whatever, started to fall apart. I think that as a leader, you have an obligation not to indulge yourself, but to keep yourself healthy and to keep yourself in optimal condition. And because you can't separate out my brain that goes to work and my brain that comes home to my family, and my body's with me wherever I'm going, and my emotions are with me wherever I'm going, and they're all mixed together. Since none of those can really be separated out, if you can become healthy in any one area, it spreads to other areas. But if you neglect any one area, or you allow any area to not be healthy, that also spreads. And so I think you have an obligation as a leader to take care of yourself, because I find that leaders who really focus on being truly good leaders at the core of what leadership is also take care of their families. They're not neglecting their families. They're also usually involved in their communities. Maybe they're not at different parts of the career, it might express itself in different ways, but they show up and they're able to be a strength around them because they're strong internally. And so I think that's super important.
So you lead from who you are, and you can't be what you're not.
Yeah.
And to try to lead from somebody else's place is just not going to work. One of the things that I learned through coaching is that I had to be who I was, and I couldn't be a different coach. I had to do it my way,
right,
and the way that I understood it and the way that I did it. I tripped over myself many a times
sure,
as a coach, because that wasn't, what am I doing? And I realized do you.
There's definitely lessons we can learn and should learn from other people about skills and about approaches and so on. But yeah, each of us, we are who we are. And you want to be the healthiest, I think, version of that, and then learn how to express that in ways that are effective. Me just being fully me doesn't make me effective. I also have to learn skills. And it's like an athlete. You can be a completely healthy human being, but not be able to play basketball. You have to learn skills on top of it and the disciplines and so on.
There were 5 things that you used to build your book around. It was healthy habits, conditioning, strength, power, and endurance.
Yeah.
And when we come back, we're going to try to touch on a little bit of all of those, but
Sure.
I really want to talk about the strength and power, because I never separated them the way you did. You talked about them differently, and I thought that was really, really good. We'll be back with Christian Muntean right after this break on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast.
We hope you're enjoying Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Paralysis to Purpose for more updates. Also, check out David's website at davidcookspeaks.com to learn more about his mission and purchase his book, Getting Undressed, From Paralysis to Purpose.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, David Cook, with our guest, Christian Muntean, and we are about to dive into his book some more. And the book, again, is called Train to Lead, and it's really good. Before we left, I mentioned the 5, maybe pillars, maybe a word that we could use for that you built your thesis around, and it's dealt with healthy habits, conditioning, strength, power, and endurance, all things that definitely are part of successful athletes, but you definitely transfer that over into leadership. I randomly turned in our break to chapter 7 in his book, and it talks about priority management and becoming a master of space and time. All the chapters are really good. But this one here, I got more orange highlights in this one probably than any other chapter, because it talked about discipline to me. This was a chapter about discipline, which is needed in leadership and in our personal lives. Walk us through the importance of, you said 3 things: calendar blocking, attention blocking, and energy blocking, and being the gatekeeper of your space and of your mind.
It doesn't surprise me that this stood out to you, because as I was mentioning on the break, regardless of why I get hired by an executive or owner, we almost always have to do work in this space. When I'm teaching on the topic, not necessarily when I'm coaching, but when I'm teaching on it, I point out that this is not really a uniquely leadership topic. This is just a self-management topic. It applies to anybody doing anything. But for leaders, it becomes critical, because I would posit that if you can't manage yourself or lead yourself, you're going to struggle trying to lead other people or manage other people. And the primary challenge that leaders have is in getting overwhelmed with all of the things that need to be done and all of the stuff that rolls uphill, all of the problems that get dumped on their plate, or there's so many glittery, shiny things and they're chasing everything all at once, or they're putting out fires, or whatever the analogies they like to use to describe why they're not staying focused. And so there's 3 basic tools that are important to pay attention to. And there's really good science. I won't get into it right now, but there's really good research and science around each of them. The first one that I really have personally found to be most valuable is the energy blocking. And that sounds a little more woo-woo maybe than what it is. All it really means is I only have so much good energy in a day, like the ability to get up and do real deep creative thinking around tough problems, or to create. I can't do that for 12 hours a day straight. It's just, and nobody can, or very few people can. Most people, and there's some really interesting science just around how your body moves through, like even your body chemistry moves through sort of cycles of higher energy and higher focus, and then lower focus and lower energy. And most people only have 1 or 2, maybe 3 blocks of time during a day where they can really put into deep work. And then after that, they're just gassed out. And so learning to recognize when those times are, for most people, the first one's earlier in the morning. And it's going to be different for everybody based off of your own body and your own kind of patterns in life. But when you start to learn, like, oh, okay, at work from 8:30 to 9:30 or 10:30, that's really when I'm most productive. Well, don't let that time get sucked up by emails and by other things. So a lot of it's just recognizing, when do I have energy? And then doing things in your life that protect your energy so it's not being bled out uselessly. And then finding out what re-energizes you. Because, it's like gas in the car. Your tank only holds so much, and you want to make sure that you're using it. Using a fitness analogy, if you're playing a basketball game, I played basketball in high school, not at any of the levels that you were at, but in high school, you can't do a full court press 100% speed for an entire game without gassing out your players. And so you have to figure out, how do you expand their energy because they have a whole game to go through? And how do you use your bench and all of that? And so it's that kind of a concept. Calendar blocking is huge because, and really what you do is you block time around your energy. For example, I do a lot of writing, and writing has been very significant for my career, both as an author of books, but producing articles, producing other kinds of resources for people. And I know that I do that best first thing in the day. Towards the end of the day, I don't have as much energy for that. It's harder for me to sit down and be really creative. Anything I try to do will take longer. Mm-hmm. And so I do better towards the end of the day if I have meetings with people, because then their energy helps me stay focused and move forward. But when I'm just on my own focused, I do better in the mornings. And because I know that about myself, I block times in my calendar. And so my assistant, when she schedules things, she makes sure that everything's scheduled around those times, because I've made them sacred for me, because that's when I get a lot of work done.
You call that one attention blocking as well. That's what was so profound to me. I thought about that. I'm like, you know what? I waste a lot of time. I'm not using my energy wisely based on my productivity. And then you stick with something too long, diminishing marginal return sets in at some point. One of the things that you did in your book was give practical ways to get these things done.
The whole book, I was trying to write it in a way where it was coaching somebody, where if they weren't hiring me, they could read the book and basically walk themselves through this process. That's how I wanted to create it. So it would be that useful and that practical. And around this topic, for the listeners, I find that my clients usually resist it because they want to be able to do 15 things at once. And they believe they have to, because you got to put all the fires out and you got to handle this and you got to do all that. And your computer's dinging at you because you've got notifications on it. Phones are ringing, all the stuff. People are walking into your office or wherever you work. And they don't believe that it's possible to narrow it down for even portions of your day. And the reality is, when they finally do, when they finally say, okay, the whole day maybe can't be dedicated to just me thinking, but maybe an hour and a half can, or 45 minutes each day. When they finally do that, they gain dramatic traction in what they're trying to accomplish at work. And the testimonials that are most satisfying to me, after a few months, their spouses come back and say, my husband or my wife or my partner's changed. They're home now. They're home on time. They're able to be with the kids. They're able to be present through the weekends. And it's because you focus your time and you actually accomplish outcomes instead of just being busy. There's some interesting studies just looking at multitasking and finding that the more things you try to do, a certain amount of things, not that many, it has a similar impact on your judgment and your ability to make decisions as alcohol will. Because you can't actually do more than one thing at a time. So what you're doing is you're shifting attention back and forth, which requires a start and stop each time you do that. There's a lot of cool studies coming out now that they can study the brain more closely over the last 15, 20 years. But physically, it just wears your brain out, because each time you switch, it takes mental, like actual energy to do those switches. And so you can't just get invested in something and make progress. You're having to make a switch, and each switch costs you something, but it's not producing anything. And so if you can just dedicate to, I'm switching to this topic and I'm going to spend 30 minutes here or half an hour or 45 minutes or whatever, and then I'll make my next switch, you gain way more ground. For myself, as a good example of this, when it comes to writing, it used to take me about 40 hours to write an article. And because that was so long and so painful, I only wrote a few a year because it just consumed so much time. But it's because I was doing it all in the wrong ways. Now, an average article for me might take about 90 minutes to write. And it's the same length of article. The quality has probably gone up exponentially. And I'm writing them every week. Plus, I've written books, plus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because I've learned when in my day are the juices flowing. And then how do I make sure nothing interrupts that? And when I do that, the article comes out in 90 minutes. If for some reason I decide to check email and I look at this and I decide to read the news and whatever, that same article will take me 5 or 6 or 8 hours to write.
That last part about locking everything else out, shutting everything else down, that's really key. And I think you almost have to practice that.
You absolutely have to. And one of the challenges for leaders in that is you have to train your team to respect that. Many leaders struggle with the need to be seen as busy or the need to be seen as responsive perpetually. That's where you start to see that earlier conversation we had about working on yourself. Like if you're feeling insecure about how your team sees you, then that's going to show up in different ways. And you're going to do really time-wasting things just to make yourself feel better. Yeah. The other side of this is that leaders have to train their team to basically respect that time. Like, no, you can't walk into between 9 and 10 in the morning, don't walk into my office. And you teach them to respect that. And they will. It's not as painful as leaders think it will be, but they often think it will be or that it'll be impossible. Many leaders are driven by having to put out fires. And that fires, any kind of chronic problem or perpetual problems that are happening, almost always are indicative of issues with your systems or your culture. 85, 90% of the time, it could be solved by coming up with a better process or system or adjusting something in your culture. If you have a culture where there's always fires, or you have an environment where there's always fires, that's a leadership issue because the leader hasn't chosen to address those things. And they often don't, because you don't have to make good leadership decisions if there's always a fire that you get to ride in and be a hero to fix or to address. And so it can make you look like you're performing the duties of leadership when you're actually not leading anyone. It's just urgency leading you, someone else's problems leading you.
I want to come back to culture after this question. How important is sleep and just shutting things down so that you can get re-energized? And in the context of family, relationship with your spouse and your job, how do you get your clients to buy in to go to sleep?
That's hard. And it is huge. Like getting a full night's rest on a regular basis has a profound impact on your attitude, your mood, your ability to make good decisions quickly, to be able to handle stress or avoid stress. I mean, it has such a broad ripple effect. And so many new problems get created just due to a lack of sleep, that if you prioritize getting good sleep, I mean, it's the same thing. Like I'm sure for athletes, I know for myself, when I train, if I don't sleep well, I notice that when I go work out the next day. I mean, I feel it right away. All of a sudden my reps are down or the weights aren't as easy to lift or whatever the thing is. And so it's the same thing as a leader. You're working with what you got. And if you're not recharging yourself, additionally, I think along with just re-energizing yourself with sleep, I think sleep helps you sort through stuff. I think your subconscious is doing something while you sleep, and it can take complicated issues and sometimes just sort them out for you or help you achieve greater clarity. If you just say, all right, I'm going to get a good 7-8 hours of sleep or whatever you need. That's why you have this idea of a tough problem. Well, let's sleep on it before we make a decision. The reason people say that so broadly is because something happens when you sleep. You're no longer being reactive, and you tend to have clear, better decision-making capacity at that point. So yeah, I'm a big believer in the need for good sleep. It's not easy to do, though.
No, I've had sleepless nights, and because I can't shut my mind off. I do think there is something to be said for that time of self-reflection, meditation, to decompress and learn how to empty your mind. And that takes a lot of practice.
So one of the things, and maybe this is helpful for some leaders, it took me a long time to learn this. And even after I heard it, it took me a long time to accept it. And I had to hit personal walls before I was willing to look for new solutions. And maybe smarter, wiser people that are listening don't need to hit the wall themselves. They can just learn from someone else's, mistakes. Sleep is a good test for self-management, because if you want to sleep well, you do have to land the plane, so to speak, earlier. And so you do need to spend about an hour letting your systems shut down. So for myself, that has to do with the lighting I have in the house, how I relate to screen time. I usually stretch out for a while or do a myofascial release because it triggers your parasympathetic system. It relaxes your muscles, so it's easier to sleep. So I have a routine, I guess, of things that I do to help myself start to wind down. That takes some advanced planning, because you can't just charge into bed going at 100% and then hope to just shut off. But another thing is, if you're drinking coffee late at night, depending on how that impacts your system, or when you eat, and everybody's body's a little bit different, but there's decisions that you might be making 10 or 12 hours before you want to go to bed that will influence whether or not you sleep well. And so what you start to realize is sleep on its own, your ability to get consistent good night's sleep, becomes indicative of how well you're managing yourself or aware of yourself over the course of your day. It's not the only, thing you should be paying attention to, but I think if you can do what it takes to get regular good sleep, that means you're getting a lot of other things right in your life, probably. And if you're getting the good sleep, it's more easy to get other things right, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I do drink tart cherry juice sometime an hour before I go to bed. It has the same qualities as melatonin.
Oh, does it?
Yes. And it is an amazing thing to sip an hour or so before you get ready to go to bed, and you will sleep. I didn't believe it. I'm just telling you right now.
Yeah.
I didn't believe it. And
interesting.
It does work. In the book, you talked about how culture and conflict have a relationship of sorts. How do you define culture?
Culture, it's a set of shared values and beliefs and behaviors in terms of how they're expressed. And so it comes from this understanding of the beliefs of how life works and what's real, and then the values that establish how decisions are made and what your priorities are, and then shared ways of relating to that. And so that's how I define culture. So when it comes to conflict, what I'm looking for in terms of culture is, what are the shared beliefs or values or behaviors that are causing people to disagree or not address issues. A very common cultural dynamic is a tendency to avoid conflict or avoid accountability. So they avoid talking about difficult issues. That creates huge problems in businesses or nonprofits or whatever. And so that often comes from a shared belief that conflict is somehow wrong. It's either immoral, or it's damaging, or it's going to break a relationship or end something that we desire. And because of that fear around it, we don't acknowledge that something is going sideways, and we just deny it until it's too big and it comes to a head. If that's a dynamic I'm working with the client, then we try to challenge what those core beliefs are and where they come from, and look at changing them.
In my book, I talked about trying to create a winning culture at high school where I started coaching, where we had that
Yeah.
winless season. And it was a step-by-step thing. But for that situation, it was as much about what we would not do versus what we would do. We don't do that here. That's not part of what we do. And I think a lot of times I had to shift their focus so that they could understand this is what we do. This is what we believe.
Yeah.
This is how we move forward. Power and strength. You said strength moves things. Power is momentum.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Strength technically is the ability to exert force and create movement. And so if you're bench pressing something, it's the ability to exert force on that bar and make it move or to prevent movement in some way. So there's 5 basic practices that I identify as key leadership strengths. And this comes from very well established research from a book called The Leadership Challenge by Doctors Kouzes and Posner. But this has to do with being a good model of how to do things, how to inspire a shared vision, enabling others to act, how to challenge process as well, or challenge the way things are, and how to encourage people. And if you have those 5 strengths down, you can lead effectively in many, many situations. Power is the ability to engage those strengths quickly, to be able to generate momentum, or to be able to shift the direction of something. So if you want basically change.
Yeah.
And so the 3 areas that I identify where power is most often needed, where you need to be able to create momentum or change a direction, is in conflict or in crisis or when you're creating change in some way. And they're challenging areas. They're dynamic. Power physically is the ability to harness strength quickly or explosively. That's what that means. And because you can be very, very strong, but not move very quick. And power is when you can move so fast that it causes your body to leap off the ground, or you can throw a shot put across the field or whatever it is. It has to have this explosive element to it. And so that's what we're trying to do is differentiate those two and then help people understand. And I know there's other ways to interpret power, but for the purposes of the kind of the illustrations I'm using in the book, that's how I'm framing it, in the sense of being able to address those 3 areas.
I've never heard anyone say you misuse your strength, but I have heard people say he or she misused their power. When you're in a leadership position, ego is knocking on that door
Right.
of power
Right.
all the time. You said power is a magnifier. It's like money. In and of itself is nothing, but it reveals who you are. How do you prevent misusing your power?
Well, I think this goes back to where I start the book out in terms of, I call it nutrition and environment. And it has to do with this basic idea of determining who you are and what's important to you and how you see things, and making sure that you have influences in your life that reflect or support the values that you're trying to pursue. Assuming you're the kind of person who doesn't want to misuse power, because the person who is comfortable with that isn't going to care about any of this anyways. But the person who doesn't want to do that, you really have to spend time around people who are powerful but don't misuse it. I'll use an example from Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So I'm 200 pounds. I'm pretty fit. I was a strength conditioning instructor for a lot of years, and so I'm strong. I had to learn, and it was hard for me to learn coming into jiu-jitsu, that if I'm just overpowering all of my opponents, my jiu-jitsu is lousy. And so all I have to do is come into contact with someone who's just actually better at it than I am, and they'll beat me. Or if they're bigger or stronger than me at all, because I didn't actually learn jiu-jitsu, they'll just overpower me. And so I realized I couldn't do as much if I just relied on my personal physical power on its own. The other thing that I realized is if I just overpowered people constantly, all of the people in the gym who were smaller than me didn't want to practice with me anymore. I wasn't a safe person, or I didn't feel good for them to be around. And it's the same thing in the workplace, that if all you use is your power to make things happen, when you don't have power in a situation and all you have is influence, you realize your influence is very anemic and people don't listen to you or they don't respect you. Or you've used your power so much and you've hurt people or squelched them so much with it that they no longer really want to participate in the things that you're trying to get done. And you'll find that it weakens your overall ability to accomplish things. There's a lot of great leadership teaching in the military, a lot of really effective quality content there. But a lot of military leaders that I coach, especially when they're coming out of the military, what they don't recognize is there's a command and control background that their leadership happens within that context. And even though they'll usually have all been taught really great concepts around influence and engaging with people and all of that, you can ultimately still give orders to someone and just make them do what you said. When they move into a context where you can't do that, when they don't have that same power anymore, and now that they have to use influence more, you start to see, did they ever actually learn that?
Which is more significant?
I think that influence is more important.
Is there a way to develop your influence?
Yes. And this came from another study by Kouzes and Posner, actually, and they wrote a book about it called Credibility. You build your influence primarily, it's not the only way, but the primary way that you do it is when people trust, that you will do what you say you will do, but then also that the resources that you bring to the table are viable resources. So if you bring ideas or recommendations or tools or a team to play, people know that they can count on it. And when you have that, over time, people realize when this person shows up and they make a suggestion, we should listen to it because they're often right. And they're not just, shooting from the hip. There's some substance behind it. Your credibility grows. And it takes time to build that kind of influence. But over time, you do get it. There's other ways to build influence too. I mean, you could be a TikTok influencer and not have any of that and just be wearing tight yoga pants and have some influence. Sure. But it's going to be thin and it's probably not going to last that long.
One of the words that we use a lot is perseverance. And your book talked about sustained success. And we touched on that before without calling it perseverance. Can you tell the audience how to sustain some of the things that we talked about today, about changing your mindset, blocking out time, being disciplined, and how do you sustain that?
That's a big topic, but it is important. And long-term endurance, like to be able to lead a long-term project to success, something that might take years to accomplish, or to be a long-term leader of your organization without burning out and so on. I think that comes down to a couple of different things. One is basically making it easier to do. If the job is always hard, then you're not going to sustain. So building good systems, building good structures so that things are sort of automated, so to speak, or they're easier to do. That part of it is important. I think also keeping yourself fresh with new challenges or new learning so that you're not getting to a place where everything is just routine and you're no longer being creative or thinking, or you're not being challenged anymore. I think that's important. Another element, and it goes back to, the book in a way ends where it begins with the self-care concept, where if you don't have like a basic level of fitness, it's hard to do these other things, but you can't do things for a long time if you're also not taking care of yourself. And so I think you probably saw this with elite athletes. On one hand, you have to sleep, you have to eat well, you have to hang out with people that are encouraging you to be healthy and not unhealthy and so on, to even be able to be a decent athlete. But on the other hand, you have to still sleep, but then you probably also need to do things like see a physical therapist or get massages or sit in a sauna, take breaks, not constantly train all the time, learn to have training rhythms that are balanced. So maybe you're not lifting heavy every day or sprinting hard every day, and you're taking breaks periodically and so on. It's knowing how to have rhythms so that you can be really effective. One of my favorite assignments to give clients is to make them go away on a vacation. And so I do this, I use this a lot. I've become known for this enough where if clients are sometimes working with other professionals that know me, they'll ask yet, has Christian sent you on a vacation yet? A vacation, you just needed to take a break. I think it's also good to go someplace new because it makes your brain think differently. You just see things differently. It exposes you to new people and new ways of being. But the other part of it, as a leader, if your team can function well without your presence, you've done a good job building your team. If they can't, then you as a leader have created a dependency which handicaps your team. And that's hard for a lot of leaders to get their head around because they believe that dependency is an indicator of my value. But your greatest value is to build a team that can function well without you. And when you're there, you're enhancing them, you're providing direction, you're providing mentoring and those things, but they don't have to have you there to perform. And so I start out with my clients. I'll send them away for a week. Okay, now next year, we're going to go away for 2 weeks. Okay, next year, we're going to try to go away for a month or for 2 months. And we just build on it. And the longer they can go away, the healthier and more effective their team is. And particularly when I'm working with clients that want to sell their companies, unless they can actually leave for a while, they don't have a company that's probably going to sell for very much, if at all.
That was really good. I need to hire you so I can go on vacation.
Okay.
I know that. Couple other quick notes here that are written down. You define encouragement as to make strong.
Yeah.
One of the things that I did as a coach and as an educator, I thought one of my greatest responsibilities was to instill confidence in my players and in my students. To make strong, that's a great definition. How'd you come up with that?
I didn't. That comes from the French. That's the origination of the word encourage. And I don't speak French well enough to say the word well, but basically what it means is to put heart into or to put strength into somebody. And so you're putting courage or strength into someone. And that's where I went back to that story of the guy that was the ex-Marine Force Recon guy. Part of that was an example of him putting courage or strength into me to go back out and literally keep fighting in a play way, not a war, but to go fight opponents, to do something that didn't feel comfortable and I didn't want to do. He put that back into me. And it wasn't through attaboys or slapping me on the back or telling me how awesome I was. There's a place for that. But what he did is he reshaped my perspective and it put courage into me. And the reason I framed it that way is because there's absolutely a place for acknowledging the good things that people have done and acknowledging their potential. And people don't often hear that enough. But some leaders think that's all that encouragement is. And really, it needs to somehow change somebody's heart enough where they're willing to take on a task or a challenge that previously they were inhibited to do. And true encouragement isn't just me saying, hey, you're awesome. It's me doing or saying something that transforms you in some way and allows you to take another step forward that maybe you wouldn't have done otherwise.
Man, you said something there that leads me into a question about faith, because you talked about touching people's heart and making it a change. Have you found that there are some who practice a faith of some sort that impacts their ability to help manage themselves, quiet themselves, give a different perspective?
That's a new question for me. I am a Christian, so I'm a person of faith. And I want to expand this concept of faith to being able to see potential in something that as of right now isn't there, or that you can't maybe prove it in some way. And you see this, there's actually a lot of research around having belief that circumstances can change, having a belief that your team can succeed, having belief that someone can overcome, and having faith for others, not necessarily only of a religious or spiritual nature. That kind of faith is absolutely foundational and critical. Personally, I believe if you can connect that to God, then that creates a congruency for yourself or your worldview. That makes it easier for you to navigate different situations.
The ability to see what's not there right now, that mindset that you talked about at the beginning of the podcast, where you are now in a position where you have conditioned your mind to see where you're going, not what it is right now, but see the end, can help motivate and inspire and give direction and that type of stuff.
I was doing a mediation with part of my background's in dispute resolution and mediation. And I was actually working with one of the parties was actually a married couple, a pastor and two pastors, two church leaders. And the wife was so embittered about a certain situation. And this situation was a big, big deal. It was a very heavy situation that had happened. So it was understandable, like where she was coming from. But my point to her, and this speaks to faith a little bit, like all she could imagine were negative things about the other people. And all she could imagine were, and these were people that were trying to reconcile, they were trying to sort things out. And the nature of this dispute had nothing to do with the two people that were actually in the dispute. It had to do with something that had happened to someone else, and they had taken sides on it. And my comment to her is, if all you can believe or see is negative things about this individual, then there is no possibility of a positive solution or reconciliation. Like, you have to at least be able to allow for the opportunity to have a little bit of faith to see that maybe things could get better. And at the time, she couldn't see that. But about 2 or 3 years later, I got a letter back from the other side of that party, and they had actually reconciled at that point. But it couldn't have happened unless she finally opened herself up to that. We all have faith of some kind, and what you actually believe really dictates the outcomes that you're going to get.
And it goes back to the mind again, how powerful the mind is. And once you get that clear, and then you have that belief in there, it can drive you and keep you going. So that's great.
I think spiritually, just to touch on it, I do think there's an element where if you do have some kind of guiding influence in shaping your values and your perspectives, I think that's important and that's helpful, because I don't think that we on our own just naturally always arrive at the right set of conclusions.
This has been really good. The book is called Train to Lead, The Unstoppable Leader's Plan for Peak Performance by Christian Muntean. Go get it. It's on his website, audiobook, ebook, paperback. I think it's worth a read. If you really want to get yourself together, whether it's to lead your family or to lead at a job or whatever, this book will help, because I don't think there's a stone that wasn't unturned in this book. And it was very thoughtful, very intentional, and it's a quicker read than you think. It'll slow you down when you get to the exercises because you've got some work to do, but just getting to the concepts was really good. So I thank you for that. Now, before we go, every guest on the podcast gets to respond when they hear these 3 words individually. The first one is perspective.
Oh, I think you can only lead to what you see. And so I think making sure that your perspective is as healthy and as broad as possible, I think is critical.
Perseverance.
The biggest differentiator that I have found between real successful leaders and particularly entrepreneurs are those who can persevere.
Partnerships.
I wouldn't be where I'm at right now if people didn't partner with me and help carry me, and if I didn't find good partners. I think partnerships, it's very hard to go alone.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad we had a chance to meet today and talk about your book.
I wrote the book because I really have a heart to help leaders be successful. I wanted to make it simple for people to be effective at leadership. There's a lot of books and a lot of content out there, but it's hard for people to know where to start and then how to move their way through it. And that's really my goal with the book, is to serve leaders by providing a framework that they can become a leader more quickly and more effectively.
People wanted to follow you or get a hold of you. What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, the best way is to come to my website, www.christianmuntean.com. And there's a lot of free resources there, and as well as ways to reach me if they want to do that.
Again, thank you so much, all the way from the great state of Alaska. I'll be looking for some smoking some salmon in my mailbox. just throw it out there.
Yeah.
Well, until next time on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, this is David Cooks reminding you that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
Thank you, David.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
There's a million things that we want to do in life, and we tell ourselves we're not good enough, we're not smart enough. whatever it is that's holding us back. And it's scary to do something new.
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
But I think at the end of the day, if you continue to wake up and have that calling to go do it. It doesn't matter how scary it is. Set deadlines for yourself and go meet them. A goal without a deadline is just a dream. I think that's something that we end up 10 years passes before we know it, and we never ended up going after what we wanted because we said we'd do it next year or next year. So at some point you just got to go and do it.
Paralysis to purpose.